The dream of a family. In the heart of a lush, green village in West Africa, nestled between towering trees and rolling hills, lived a young woman named Amina. Her village was a peaceful one, a place where everyone knew each other, and the sun painted the sky in warm hues at dusk. It was a community bound by tradition, love, and a strong sense of togetherness. Among the village's many stories, Amina's was one of hope and dreams. Amina was 26 years old, a bright and vibrant woman with sparkling eyes and a heart full of hope. She had always dreamed of creating her own family, just like the many women in her village who had come together with their husbands to raise children in love and harmony. Every evening, Amina would help her mother in the kitchen, preparing meals for their small but lively household. As she worked, she would smile to herself, imagining what it would be like to have a family of her own, a husband who would hold her hand through the good and bad times, and children who would run around the house, filling it with joy. For the past 2 years, Amina had been in a relationship with Kofi, a handsome, hardworking man who had captured her heart from the moment they met. He was kind, charming, and always made her feel special. Their love had blossomed in the quiet evenings of their village, with long walks under the stars and shared dreams about their future. Kofi had even promised to marry her, and the thought of starting a family with him filled Amina with excitement and anticipation. Her heart fluttered at the thought of the day when she would officially become his wife. One evening, Kofi came to visit Amina at her family's home. As usual, he was warm and affectionate, but something was different. There was a coldness in his eyes that Amina couldn't ignore. He had been distant for the past few days, and she began to wonder if something was wrong. The man who had once written her love letters, whispered sweet words into her ears, and held her close seemed to be slipping away. Amina tried to brush off the feeling, telling herself that maybe he was just tired, or perhaps something was weighing on his mind. However, as the days passed, the changes became more noticeable. Kofi's visits grew less frequent, and when he did show up, his conversations felt strained. He was no longer the warm, loving man she had known. Instead, he seemed cold, irritated by the smallest of things. He snapped at her when she made minor mistakes, and his words began to sting. He would call her names, words she had never imagined coming from him. "Why can't you ever do anything right, Amina?" he had said one evening, his voice sharp and dismissive. Amina was hurt, confused. She wondered what had happened to the man who had once looked at her with so much love. Was this a phase? Was it just a temporary change? But the more she thought about it, the more uncertainty crept into her heart. What had happened to their love? Could it be that Kofi no longer felt the same way about her? Her mind raced with questions. Why had he become distant? Had she done something wrong? Or perhaps, had he been pretending all along? Amina couldn't bring herself to ask Kofi directly, afraid of the answer. Instead, she silently observed him, hoping for a glimpse of the man she had once known. But with each passing day, the doubts grew stronger. In the quiet of her room, Amina found herself asking, "Does Kofi still love me?" The uncertainty weighed heavily on her heart, and for the first time in a long while, she wasn't sure about the future she had once imagined so clearly. What had once been a love full of promise now felt fragile, slipping away like sand through her fingers, betrayal and heartbreak. The sun had barely risen over Amina's village, casting long shadows across the dirt roads as the sound of roosters crowing echoed through the morning air. The village, though calm and peaceful, seemed far too small for the turmoil brewing in Amina's heart. The joy she once felt about her engagement to Kofi had now been replaced by a quiet, gnawing dread. The doubts that had begun to creep into her mind were no longer whispers, they had become loud, painful questions that consumed her thoughts. For the last few days, Amina had been restless. Kofi's coldness towards her had deepened, and his actions seemed more distant and hostile. She wondered if there had been someone else in his life, someone who could explain the sudden, unexplainable shift in his behavior. The thought haunted her, but she pushed it aside, convincing herself that maybe she was overthinking things. That was until one fateful Saturday afternoon. Amina had planned to visit Kofi's house to surprise him with a home-cooked meal. She was determined to bring some warmth back into their relationship, to rekindle the bond they had once shared. But as she approached his house, something caught her attention. She stopped in her tracks when she heard voices through the thin walls of his home. It was a conversation that quickly escalated into laughter that sounded foreign to Amina's ears. Curiosity led her closer to the door, and without thinking, she pushed it open. The sight that greeted her was one she would never forget. There, lying in Kofi's bed, was Kofi himself, tangled in the arms of another woman. The woman, whom Amina had never seen before, was smiling and laughing, her hands brushing through Kofi's hair as if they shared the most intimate connection. Kofi, caught off guard, quickly pulled away, his face flushing with surprise and guilt. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Amina stood frozen in the doorway, her heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. She could barely comprehend what she was seeing. The man she loved, the man she thought she would marry, was in bed with someone else, someone who had taken her place in his life. For a long moment, neither Kofi nor the woman said anything. The room was thick with shame, and Amina could feel the sting of betrayal burning through her chest. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She turned on her heels and fled the house, her heart racing and her breath ragged. She ran through the village, her feet pounding against the dirt road, until she could no longer see Kofi's house behind her. When she finally stopped, out of breath and in a state of shock, she locked herself in her room and sat on the cold floor, her mind swirling with emotions too complicated to understand. She felt humiliated, rejected, and lost. She had trusted Kofi with everything, her heart, her future, her dreams of a family. But now, those dreams had shattered like glass. The pain was unbearable. How could Kofi have done this to her? How could he betray the love they had shared? Amina felt her whole world come crashing down around her. The thought of confronting Kofi lingered in her mind, but the fear of the truth, of what he might say or deny, kept her silent. She was terrified of losing her family's respect, of them discovering the truth about her failed engagement. The shame of being discarded by the man she thought she would marry seemed too much to bear. Amina's thoughts spiraled into a dark, lonely place. She felt utterly alone, as if no one could understand the depth of her pain. She began to question herself, was she not good enough? Had she done something wrong? She replayed every moment of their relationship, searching for any sign she might have missed, any indication that Kofi was no longer the man he once was. But it was all a blur. She was left with nothing but the cold, harsh truth. Days passed, and Amina withdrew from everyone. She refused to leave her room, unable to face the world outside. The village, once a place of comfort and familiarity, now felt like an unbearable reminder of her failure. Her family, her friends, no one could console her. She felt like a shadow of herself, an empty vessel. Kofi's betrayal had cut deeper than she could have ever imagined, and now she wondered if she could ever trust anyone again. How could she move forward when the man she had placed all her faith in had broken her heart? The love she had once felt for him now felt like a distant memory, tainted by the harsh reality of betrayal. Amina's heart ached with loneliness, her tears falling silently as she questioned the path that had led her here. Would she ever be able to heal from this? Would she ever find the strength to move on and rebuild her life, or was she doomed to live in the shadow of this betrayal forever? The answers felt so far away, and for the first time in a long while, Amina felt lost, completely and utterly lost without a new beginning. The days following Amina's painful discovery about Kofi were filled with a quiet kind of chaos. She couldn't escape the images that haunted her. The sight of Kofi with another woman, the sound of their laughter ringing in her ears. But as time passed, Amina knew she couldn't hide from reality forever. There were still many questions to answer, and one of them had already begun to grow inside her, unseen, but very real. It was a Sunday morning when Amina first felt the signs. Her stomach churned, and she felt an unfamiliar heaviness, as though something deep inside her was shifting. She thought little of it at first, brushing it off as stress or perhaps something she ate. But as the days wore on, the symptoms persisted: nausea, dizziness, and an unexplainable fatigue that left her feeling drained. Amina decided to visit the local herbalist, hoping for some clarity. The herbalist, an elderly woman known for her wisdom and knowledge of herbs, examined Amina carefully. After a series of questions and a close look at her health, the herbalist spoke the words that changed everything. "You are with child, Amina. You are pregnant." Amina was struck motionless. She felt as though the world had tilted on its axis. Pregnant? How could this be? Her mind raced. Kofi had already betrayed her, and now she was carrying his child. She could barely comprehend what she had just heard. The thought of being pregnant filled her with dread. She wasn't ready for this, not in the way she had imagined. And with the betrayal still fresh in her heart, Amina didn't know how to feel. She wanted to scream, to run away, to make everything go back to how it was before. As Amina returned home, the weight of the news began to sink in. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: fear, confusion, and sorrow. She knew what she had to do, but the fear of facing her family, especially her father, was overwhelming. How could she explain this to them? How could she face her parents after everything that had happened? Her mother, ever the loving and supportive presence, noticed her daughter's turmoil right away. She comforted Amina, telling her not to worry, that she would help her through this. For a moment, Amina felt a flicker of hope. Her mother was happy about the pregnancy, excited even, as though this child could somehow heal the wounds that had been opened in Amina's heart. But the joy that Amina's mother expressed was far from what Amina herself felt. The truth was, Amina was conflicted. She didn't want to bring a child into a world that felt so broken, so unfair. She didn't want to raise a child in the shadow of a relationship that had crumbled beneath her. And yet, the reality of the pregnancy left her feeling trapped, like there was no way out, no choice but to carry on with the life that had been forced upon her. As the days passed, Amina's internal battle intensified. Her heart wanted to break free, to let go of the pain that Kofi had caused, but the pregnancy held her in place. She knew that the only way to truly move forward was to confront her past. To face the truth about Kofi and call off their engagement once and for all. But even as she made the decision to stand up for herself, Amina couldn't help but feel the sting of shame and fear. She had let herself be deceived, let herself fall for a man who didn't deserve her. And now, she had to confront her family and tell them everything. One evening, Amina gathered her parents in the small living room of their home. Her mother sat beside her, holding her hand in reassurance, but Amina could feel her own heart pounding in her chest. Her father, ever the stern figure in their home, sat across from her, his gaze hard and unblinking. "I can't marry Kofi," Amina began, her voice shaking but steady. I found him with another woman. He has betrayed me." There was a heavy silence in the room as her father's face turned red with anger. His eyes widened in disbelief, his lips pressed into a tight line. He stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You want to break off the engagement," he barked, his voice harsh. "And after all this time, you have the nerve to come to me with this." Amina's mother looked at her father, trying to calm him, but her father was beyond reason. "You are pregnant, Amina," he said through gritted teeth. "How could you allow this to happen? You have dishonored this family. Tears welled in Amina's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. I didn't want this to happen, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I can't stay in a relationship built on lies. I can't marry a man who doesn't respect me. Her father's face twisted with anger, and his voice cracked as he pointed at the door. You are a disgrace. You have ruined my reputation. I cannot have you in my house any longer. Leave. Now. Amina felt the full force of his rejection hit her like a blow. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. Her father, the man she had looked up to all her life, was throwing her out. She opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself, but no words came. She had no fight left in her. Her mother tried to interject, but her father's decision was final. Go. You will not stay here. Not with this disgrace. With her heart shattering into pieces, Amina slowly stood up and left the house, her father's cruel words echoing in her ears. She had nowhere to go, no place to hide from the shame she felt. Her family had turned their backs on her. Amina walked through the village, her eyes fixed on the ground as the weight of everything pressed down on her. She couldn't go back to Kofi. He had made it clear he wasn't going to take responsibility for her or the child. Her life felt like it was spiraling out of control, and yet, deep down, Amina knew this was the beginning of something new. Something had to change. She had to change. And no matter how uncertain or difficult the road ahead seemed, Amina was determined to rebuild her life, for herself and for the child she carried inside her. The road was long, and the future was unknown, but for the first time in weeks, Amina felt a spark of determination. She would rise above this. She would find a way to move forward, life with Kofi, the struggle. The walls of Kofi's home felt suffocating, like a prison where Amina could no longer escape the bitterness that had seeped into her life. The house, which should have been a place of comfort and refuge, had turned into a daily reminder of the betrayal that had shattered her world. What once was a place where laughter and love filled the air now echoed with tension, silence, and resentment. After being cast out by her own father, Amina had nowhere else to go. With no other option, she returned to Kofi, the man who had broken her heart, hoping that somehow things would work themselves out. But she soon realized that the worst was yet to come. Kofi had agreed to let her stay under one condition: she would not ask for anything. He made it clear that he was not going to take responsibility for the child she carried, nor would he offer any support. The thought of paying her bride price, a traditional sign of respect for her family and the woman he had promised to marry, was completely out of the question. He had made up his mind. He wanted nothing to do with the life they had once dreamed of. Every day felt like a struggle. Amina woke up early, her body aching from the physical toll of carrying the child, but there was no one to share the burden with her. Kofi didn't help with anything. He spent his days either at the bar with friends or ignoring her completely. The money he earned was never enough, and he refused to provide for their household, leaving Amina to scramble for whatever she could find. She took on odd jobs, from washing clothes to helping out at the market, but every penny she earned felt like a drop in an ocean of endless needs. The neighbors didn't help either. Word had spread around the village that Kofi had abandoned Amina and was not fulfilling his duties as her partner. The whispers and mocking stares followed her everywhere she went. "Look at her, the abandoned woman," some of the women in the village would say when they saw her walking past with her head lowered. "She's nothing but a failure," others would whisper as she passed by, her heart aching with each cruel word. Amina tried to block out the voices, but it was impossible. She had once been a respected woman in the village, full of hope and promise. Now, she felt as though she had lost everything: her dignity, her sense of self-worth, and even the future she had dreamed of with Kofi. Each day felt heavier than the last. The nights were the hardest. Kofi would come home late, drunk, and angry. He would berate her for the smallest things, accusing her of causing problems he refused to acknowledge. He would insult her for being pregnant, as if it were her fault that their relationship had crumbled. And when he wasn't insulting her, he simply ignored her, as though she didn't exist. "Why don't you do something useful for once?" he would say, his words cold and cutting. "You should have thought of this before, Amina. Now look at us, trapped in this mess. What good are you now?" Amina would try to keep the tears at bay, but sometimes they would fall, despite her best efforts to hold them back. She was tired, physically, emotionally, and mentally exhausted. The weight of everything she had endured threatened to break her, but she refused to let it. But no matter how hard she tried to remain strong, she couldn't escape the overwhelming sense of isolation and despair that clouded her mind. She felt as though she was walking through life with a heavy burden she couldn't set down, and there was no one to help her carry it. The villagers, who once looked up to her, now saw her as nothing more than a cautionary tale. They saw her as a woman who had failed, someone who had let herself be deceived by a man who had only ever seen her as a burden. Amina no longer saw the friendly faces that once greeted her. Instead, she saw people who turned their backs when she passed by, too ashamed to acknowledge her. Even her friends, who had once stood by her side, now distanced themselves. They had heard the rumors, seen Kofi's actions, and whispered among themselves about how Amina's life had fallen apart. Some even mocked her behind her back, calling her foolish for staying with a man who had no respect for her. "You should have left him when you had the chance," one of her former friends had said one afternoon at the market. "Now look at you, pregnant and alone." Amina wanted to scream, to tell them they didn't understand. She had been in love, and love had blinded her to the truth. But now, there was nothing left to say. Kofi had made it clear that he had no intention of taking care of her or the child. And the village had made it clear that they would never accept her. She felt as though she had no place in the world anymore. At night, after a long day of struggling just to survive, Amina would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling. She thought of the life she could have had, the family she had dreamed of. And then she thought of the child growing inside her, the one piece of hope she still held onto, even as everything else seemed to fall apart. But even the hope she felt for her child was clouded by the shame and loneliness that surrounded her. How could she give her child a better life when she couldn't even take care of herself? How could she raise a child in a house where there was no love, no respect, and no support? The road ahead seemed impossible, and Amina often felt like giving up. But deep down, a small, quiet voice inside her refused to let her surrender. Despite everything, the ridicule, the betrayal, and the isolation, Amina knew that her journey wasn't over yet. Somehow, some way, she would find a way to survive. For herself, and for the child she carried in her womb. The struggle was far from over, but Amina would not let it define her. She still had hope, even if it was just a flicker. And that flicker was enough to keep her going, to keep her fighting for the life she deserved, rejection from all sides. The holiday season arrived in Amina's village, a time when the streets were filled with laughter, music, and the smell of delicious foods being prepared for festive feasts. Families reunited, old friends came together, and the community celebrated the joy of togetherness. For many, it was a time of warmth and closeness, a time to reflect on the blessings of the past year and look forward to the new one. But for Amina, the holidays brought only a sense of isolation and deepening sorrow. After everything she had endured, after being rejected by her father and left to fend for herself, Amina thought that perhaps this time, during the holidays, her family might offer her some comfort. She had nowhere else to turn. Kofi had made it clear that he had no intention of marrying her, and she had no friends left to lean on. The only place she could think of was her father's house, hoping that perhaps he would see past the shame she carried and offer her some support. But as soon as she arrived, the welcoming arms she had hoped for were nowhere to be found. Her father, who once held her in high regard, looked at her with contempt. His face, once soft and filled with love, now showed nothing but anger and disappointment. The moment Amina stepped inside, her heart sank. Her father's harsh words filled the room. "You've come back here, after all this. You think you'll find help from me," he spat, his voice bitter. "You've brought shame to our family, Amina. A single mother with no husband. What kind of disgrace are you?" Her sisters-in-law, who had always been quick to offer judgment, looked at Amina with pity and disdain. They whispered behind her back, their eyes scanning her as though she were nothing more than a failure in their eyes. The words they exchanged made her skin crawl. "Look at her," one of her sisters-in-law muttered loud enough for Amina to hear. Pregnant and alone, begging for attention. Amina felt the weight of their judgment as if it were a physical blow. Her heart twisted, and for a moment, she wanted to disappear, to shrink away from the harsh words that were being hurled at her. But it didn't stop there. Her father's anger reached a boiling point as he glared at her, his hands trembling with rage. "You've embarrassed me, Amina," he shouted. "You're no longer welcome here. I've tried to protect you, but you've ruined everything. Get out of my house. I won't have this disgrace living under my roof." Amina felt the words cut through her like a knife. The love and respect she had once known from her father were gone. His cruelty made her stomach churn, but she couldn't bring herself to argue. There was nothing she could say to change his mind. She had nowhere else to turn. With her head hung low, Amina silently gathered her few belongings and left the house. She walked away from the place she once called home, her father's angry words echoing in her ears. The rejection from her own family felt like a final blow. It was as though she had become invisible to everyone, nothing more than a shadow of the person she used to be. The cold wind beat at her skin as she walked down the dirt road, the holiday celebrations happening around her feeling like a distant, unattainable dream. She had nowhere to go. She couldn't return to Kofi's house, where she was still unwanted and unloved. She had no place in her family, and the village had turned its back on her. Amina felt like an outcast in a world that no longer cared for her. But despite the overwhelming rejection, Amina knew she couldn't give up. She couldn't let the hurt define her. She had to keep moving forward for the sake of her child, for the sake of her own future. She might have been rejected, abandoned, and ridiculed by the very people she once trusted, but Amina was not ready to let the world break her. Not yet. That night, she returned to Kofi's house, hoping against hope that somehow, he might change. Maybe he would see her desperation, her need for security, and he would take her in, even if it was just for the sake of their child. She knocked on his door, her heart racing, but Kofi opened the door with a cold look in his eyes. "What do you want now, Amina?" he asked, his tone harsh and dismissive. I have nowhere else to go," Amina said, her voice trembling. "Please, Kofi. We need you. We need your support. The families turned their back on me. I'm struggling. I can't do this alone." Kofi shook his head, his expression hardening. "I don't care. You think I owe you something? You're pregnant. Big deal. That's your problem, not mine." Amina felt her heart shatter as she heard his words. She had hoped for something, anything, from him. But there was no compassion in his voice. No love. Just cold indifference. He wasn't going to help her. He wasn't going to be there for her or their child. Amina realized, in that moment, that she had been fooling herself. Kofi was never going to be the man she had once believed him to be. With a heavy heart, Amina turned and left his house once more. She walked down the path, feeling more alone than ever. It felt like the world had shut its doors on her, leaving her with nothing but emptiness and despair. But Amina wasn't ready to give up. She knew that this battle was far from over. She might have been rejected by everyone, her family, Kofi, even her friends, but she would not let their rejection be the end of her story. She had to find the strength to rise again, for herself and for the child who depended on her. A turning point, rediscovery of self. Amina sat alone in the small, dimly lit room she now called home. The room, barely big enough for a bed and a small wooden table, was her sanctuary, her one place of refuge in a world that seemed to have abandoned her. The walls were bare, and the air was thick with the quiet hum of her thoughts. The child inside her womb kicked gently, reminding her that even in the deepest moments of despair, she was not truly alone. She had him, and that was all that mattered now. The weight of the days before had left its mark on her. Rejected by her father, abandoned by Kofi, and shunned by the village, Amina had lost nearly everything, except her will to survive. Each morning, she woke up with the same heaviness in her chest, yet each day, she somehow found the strength to keep going, to keep fighting. But something changed one afternoon, a moment that would turn the course of Amina's life in a new direction. It was her old friend, Ngozi, who had always been there for her during the happier times, who came to see her. Ngozi had heard the rumors that had been spreading through the village about Kofi's actions. With a deep sigh, Ngozi told Amina something that would forever change her understanding of everything that had happened. "Amina, I know you've been through a lot, but there's something you need to hear," Ngozi began, her voice quiet but filled with concern. "Kofi, he's paying another woman's bride price. He's with someone else now, and he's putting his money into her future, not yours." Amina froze, her breath catching in her throat. She stared at Ngozi, disbelief filling her chest. How could this be true? How could Kofi, the man she had once loved, the man she thought would marry her, do this? The realization hit her like a storm. She had been living in a toxic and unloving environment all along. Kofi had never truly cared for her. He had used her, discarded her when she no longer served his needs, and moved on to someone else. Amina felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and relief. The anger came from the betrayal, the sadness from the shattered dreams, but the relief was the strongest feeling. For the first time in what felt like forever, Amina saw the truth clearly. She had been holding on to a lie, hoping that somehow things would improve, that Kofi would change. But now, she knew the truth, he was never going to change. And in that moment, Amina made a choice, she would no longer let him define her. She would take control of her own life, for herself and for the child she was carrying. With Ngozi's support and encouragement, Amina began to think about her future, one that did not involve Kofi or the shame he had placed on her. She remembered the small sum of money her mother had given her before she had been cast out, and though it was not much, it was enough to help her take the first steps toward rebuilding her life. "I can do this," Amina whispered to herself, staring at the money in her hand. "I can make something of this. I won't let my life be controlled by Kofi or by anyone else." The next day, Amina ventured into the small market near her home, looking for ways to use her skills to make a living. She had always been good with her hands, cooking, crafting, and sewing. She decided to start small, opening a small stand in the market where she could sell homemade goods, clothes, fabrics, and crafts she had learned from her mother. It wasn't much, but it was hers. It was a start. And that was all she needed to begin again. Each day, Amina worked tirelessly, pouring her energy into her small business. She would wake up early, prepare her products, and set up her stand in the market. Though business was slow at first, she didn't let it discourage her. She kept pushing forward, reminding herself that every step was progress. She no longer cared about the whispers or the mockery. Amina had found her purpose again, not through the approval of others, but through her own efforts and resilience. As the weeks passed, Amina began to feel the weight in her chest lift. She had regained a sense of pride in herself, and for the first time in months, she felt like she was moving forward. Her small business grew, little by little, and with every sale, Amina felt a sense of accomplishment that she had not known in a long time. Despite the challenges she faced, working long hours, dealing with the harshness of the world around her, and caring for her growing child, Amina found strength in herself. She realized that her worth was not determined by Kofi or her family or the judgments of the village. Her worth was in her actions, her resilience, and the love she had for her child. One evening, as Amina sat in her small room, counting the earnings from the day's sales, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. Her life was no longer defined by the mistakes of the past. She was building something new, something that was entirely her own. Her child kicked inside her, a reminder that, no matter what, she had someone to live for. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, Amina knew she had the strength to face whatever came next. For the first time in a long while, she smiled, not because things were perfect, but because she had found herself again. Amina was no longer the woman who had been rejected, abandoned, and belittled. She was a woman who had rediscovered her power. And as she looked ahead, she knew that no matter what challenges awaited her, she was capable of overcoming them. Her story was just beginning.